22-12095, the state versus Lady Tremaine. All those who have business in this court may be seated. Counsel for the people, are you ready?
We are.
Counsel for defense, are you ready? You may proceed.
Bruised, empty, distraught, alone. On a beautiful starry night, while all the young women of the land danced their way through palatial halls, 19-year-old Ella Tremaine lay broken, bleeding, and battered on the floor of her locked bedroom. While all the young women of the land flashed their glittering ball gowns and clapped along to a lively beat, Ella lay shivering in torn rags. And while all the young women of the land buzzed with the excitement of possibly ensnaring the heart of their beloved prince, Ella lay broken, utterly devastated by the knowledge that she would never escape a house that had never quite become a home, but had steadily transformed into her own personal inferno, the likes of which would have shaken Dante himself to his very core. She lay there imprisoned, bruised, empty, distraught, alone. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today to ensure justice is served. For on the night of His Majesty's ball, the defendant, Lady Tremaine, Ella's vile stepmother, falsely and forcefully imprisoned Ella in a desperate attempt to ensure that her own daughters would not be overlooked by the prince. Such a heinous and criminal act is impermissible under our laws. And as the evidence will clearly show, the defendant must be found guilty. Any other conclusion would not only be an injustice to Ella, but would also betray this court's sworn duty to protect those who have been brutalized by the darkest members of our society.
Now, not all of Ella's life has been a nightmare. Growing up with her family, her mother and her father, each day they would retreat to the fireplace, read together, share their daily life, create memories. This fireplace still holds a piece of solace and refuge for Ella today. And yet, this couldn't last. When her mother succumbed to pneumonia, she was ripped away from Ella. The only thing her father knew to do in order to create this mother figure was to remarry. Little did he know that he was marrying a snake. Just as Ella was getting used to this new life, this new family, the loss of her own mother, her own father was ripped away from her. And at this point, the defendant decided to shed her skin and reveal her true nature. From here on, Ella has been her slave. Each day she would return to her room, fingers calloused and bleeding, legs too weak to go on, from the work and chores that she was forced to do by the defendant, while her own stepsisters looked on and taunted her. The only chore that Ella truly enjoyed doing was sweeping the fireplace, because it brought her back to her warm childhood, her mother, her father. And yet, not even this could last. The defendant and her daughters felt the need to taunt Ella further and give her the nickname Cinderella.
The defendant harshly critiqued all of Ella's hard work and her appearance, and she would praise her biological daughters for joining in on the taunting. After Ella completed her exhaustive list of chores that she was set each morning, the defendant would systematically rip apart everything that she'd done. This house was a war zone, with the defendant on her biological daughters on one side and Ella on the other. When Ella would talk back and try to defend herself from this verbal lashing, her punishment was to run along freshly waxed floors for hours. And after she would crash onto the unforgiving wood floors, she would have another bruise to add to her collection, along with the occasional broken bone and numerous concussions. The defendant would look on unmoved, stifling her laughter. See, the defendant was aware of Ella's marriage potential compared to that of her own daughters. As our witness, the defendant's footman, will confirm, everyone who set eyes on Ella was stunned by her beauty and grace and poise. And this only fueled the defendant's determination to break Ella's spirit through perpetual abuse. After all, a wounded opponent doesn't pose much of a threat. Unsurprisingly, this led to a hostile environment and hostility between Ella and the defendant, because Ella always stood her ground. And she came to understand that the defendant's actions were not born out of love. They were born out of absolute hatred.
Now, this confinement and hostility seemed endless, until one day, Ella received her golden ticket. An invitation, a letter from the prince himself, gilded with gold ink and marked with the royal seal, inviting her, Ella, and all the young women of the land to the royal ball, where he would choose his wife. This was Ella's escape. This was Ella's chance to escape the iron-claddness and servitude she faced under her stepmother to a happily ever after. Now, the defendant knew how much this ball meant for her daughters and feared that Ella's beauty would enrapture the prince. And so she decided not to even buy Ella a dress and deny her the opportunity altogether. Ella cried out in despair and made one last desperate attempt at the carriage. She grasped for her freedom, but the defendant grabbed her by the hair, dragged her into their home, forced her down into their room, and threw her on the floor. Ella lied there, bleeding, crying out for her dead mother and father, as the defendant bolted the door locked and left her abandoned.
Ladies and gentlemen, the defense will say that Ella's imprisonment was a form of punishment. A punishment for what, you might wonder? For having the God-given right to attend the prince's ball? For naturally being more beautiful than the defendant's daughters? No. They will try to frame innocent Cinderella as the aggressor. Ladies and gentlemen, while there was a struggle, the 6-foot, 200-pound defendant was no match for 5-foot, 105-pound Ella. Especially outside of the carriage when the defendant wrapped her Cinderella in her arms and punched her, bruised her, before grabbing her by the hair, dragging her across the concrete pavement, up the perfectly swept stairs of their home, before casting her into her room and shutting the door, locking it behind her, where Ella lay for the rest of the night, bruised, empty, distraught, and alone. Soon, our witness will confirm that all of the truths I've spoken, all that I have said is true. And no defense can supersede the truth.
Ladies and gentlemen, the facts are clear. Fortunately, the law is also clear and offers justice for Ella's deplorable treatment. False imprisonment, a crime involving 3 elements. First, a restriction of an individual's personal movement in any area, including that individual's very own room. Second, a lack of justification for that restriction. And third, a lack of consent. Now, first, you will hear that Ella was locked in her room, alone and traumatized by the defendant. At the bare minimum, this is a clear instance of restriction of movement. Furthermore, there is absolutely no justification for this restriction. In fact, the only reason that the defendant had for locking Ella in her room was the loathing and the jealousy that the defendant felt for beautiful Ella. So now, the defense may turn to their final recourse, consent. Ladies and gentlemen, you will hear that Ella cried out in protest as she was dragged by the hair to her room, thrown in, and the door slammed shut behind her. There was no consent here. And so now, although it is easy to be wrapped up in the details, this is actually a very simple case. The defendant restricted Ella's movement without justification and without consent. And so now you, members of the jury, it is your duty under the laws and the values of the land to convict the defendant of false imprisonment, providing Ella with her final remaining solace, justice.
Thank you, counsel for the people. Counsel for defense, you may proceed.
Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, good afternoon. You have just heard the state establish a case of false imprisonment as the pretense for why we are here today. However, this is not a case of false imprisonment. This is a case of parenting. And this is a case of the state overreaching its authority into our families, our private lives, and our homes. False imprisonment, as defined by the law, is the crime of restricting someone in their movement within an area without justification or consent. Lady Tremaine, upon a violent, threatening attack from her daughter, sent that daughter to her room. As Ella's mother, Lady Tremaine remains the legal authority and justification to punish her daughter as she saw fit. In examining the events of this evening, 2 distinct questions will arise. The first, was Lady Tremaine's decision to keep her daughter in her room a case of good parenting? And the second, was Lady Tremaine in violation of the law? The state's case attempts to cast doubt on the first, a question that frankly has no place in this courtroom today. It is the second question alone that is relevant to our proceedings, and I urge you to keep this in mind as we proceed. Lady Tremaine, the state would like to convince you that Lady Tremaine is a horrible mother who victimized a poor, defenseless child in favor of her biological offspring. Perhaps you may sympathize with this depiction of the evening. Perhaps you won't. What is important that we will show you is that, good mother or bad mother, there was no abridgment of the law that evening. The burden of proof, the state falls far short of meeting its burden of proof to convince us otherwise. In order for the
state to meet this burden of proof, they have to prove a number of circumstances beyond a reasonable doubt. The most important of these circumstances, that the detainment of Ella is unlawful, that is, without justification. It is in this prima facie obligation that the state's case falls apart. Parents are granted special authority under the law when it comes to rearing their children. Locking a stranger in a room without their consent, or let's say a bank robber taking hostages under the threat of death, is not reasonably equated to a parent putting a rambunctious child in a timeout. The spirit of this parental authority extends to other parts of the law. Parents decide where their child can live, how they're educated, what religion they're exposed to. And not only do parents have this right, but they also have a legal obligation to tend to the welfare of a child. If a parent doesn't provide food, shelter, water, security to the best of their financial ability, they're going to face the full consequences of the law. Detainment of a minor, and let me remind you that 19 still constitutes a minor, by a lawful guardian or parent is not unlawful imprisonment. Our society believes that parents are the best arbiters of a child's welfare, and that belief extends to how parents choose to punish their children. The state thus cannot make the case that they intend to, as they do not meet their burden of proof, because they cannot prove that Lady Tremaine maliciously intended to cause undue harm to her daughter, Ella.
Cinderella has always been a difficult child. When her father was alive, she could be quite disrespectful, and many guests at the home have noted that her treatment of his new wife, Lady Tremaine, was outright hostile. Her father tried to appease his daughter by spoiling her, spending a fortune on new clothes, a horse, anything she desired. This coddling did little to help her. When her father died, his bank accounts drained to please Cinderella. This left the family with no money. Lady Tremaine was determined to treat her no differently than her other daughters. This meant Cinderella helping out around the house. While her other sisters cooked and cleaned, day in and day out, Cinderella agreed only to tend the fire so that she could stay cozy during the winter months. Because money was in fact tight in the family, when word came of the prince's ball, Lady Tremaine had been working tirelessly and was only able to scrape enough money together for 2 dresses. The fairest way to choose which of the 3 daughters would go to the ball was by age, and this meant that Cinderella, being the youngest, would have to wait until next year's ball.
Now this made sense, given that the eldest daughters were of varying age. And Lady Tremaine was understandably desperate for her 2 daughters to find a husband to relieve them of that financial burden. After hearing this news, Ella, in her truest form, threw a tantrum, locked herself in her room, and refused to come out for 3 days. Although her sisters did admittedly mock her, they did so indignant after years of excess chores. Now I have to disagree with the prosecution when details are of no consequence, because details in this situation shine light on the right decision. On the eve of the ball, when the carriage arrived to the house, Cinderella came outside and ran towards the carriage in a fit of rage, ripping apart her sister's dresses and trying to push her way into the vehicle, which the footman will attest to, a neutral party there, mind you. As you will hear shortly, the footman had to suffer the indignity of restraining the wild child, and suffered a few bruises along the way. His account will show that, taken aback by her frantic behavior, he asked her to disembark the vehicle, which she refused. She was in such a fit that the footman and Lady Tremaine together had to remove her from the vehicle, kicking and screaming, into the house and up into her room, where she was to wait until Lady Tremaine returned from the evening's festivities.
Cinderella was out of control. Lady Tremaine, her lawful guardian, had legal justification in grounding her and in restraining her to her room for the evening. Just as a parent can assign chores, Lady Tremaine is also justified in preventing her daughter from going to a social gathering, especially given her prior patterns of behavior. Now, there are of course limits to parental immunity. Parents are criminally liable if they detain their children with malicious intent or if their detainment causes physical harm. This would exceed the bounds of parental authority. However, there is no evidence to suggest that Lady Tremaine acted with malice or that she caused any physical harm. Now, Lady Tremaine may not be the perfect mother. No mother can take this claim, especially one with 3 teenagers. However, a poor widower, she always did her best to provide for the welfare of her family. This is a classic case of a child's misbehavior necessitating the action of a mother. The mother's use of pointed punishment to correct this misbehavior. This was no act of malice. This was the act of a mother.
The key issue in this case is clear. Did Lady Tremaine act with malice in temporarily confining her daughter to her room? In order to convict, the prosecution must prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that Lady Tremaine acted maliciously with intent to do harm to her daughter in confining her to her room. Our society and our laws hold that a parent has both the authority and the responsibility to appropriately discipline their children. So, when Cinderella rushed out of the house in a rage, shoved her sisters aside, and attempted to forcefully enter the carriage, Lady Tremaine exercised that right by sending her to her room. We will clearly establish that Lady Tremaine was doing no more than disciplining a disobedient daughter who, despite repeated attempts to reach her, remained cold and distant from her mother. It will then follow that the state has no right to interfere in these matters. Our society is founded on a belief in diversity of cultures, of faiths, and yes, of methods of parenting. We ask you to protect that diversity. We ask you to protect the sanctity of the home and the importance of parental authority. And we ask you to see the state's case for what it is, an attempt to dictate what good parenting means. And we ask you to reject such an inappropriate invasion of the home by finding Lady Tremaine not guilty.
Thank you, all rise. The court is now adjourned and the jurors are excused to go and deliberate. Thank you.